Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome to the Grow Podcast, episode 68. We're getting up there. My name is David. I'm so excited that you joined us this week. I'm excited to be back after I missed episode 67.
Yeah.
Pastor Mike is with me as always. Well, thank you. Hattie did an excellent job filling in for me. Hopefully not too excellent. We'll see if I'm here in future podcasts or if she's replaced me fully. She has tons of free time. She just has no responsibilities here at the church.
Else to do,
So plenty of time to host podcasts. But yeah, that was a fun one last week. I was sad that I missed. I was looking forward to that podcast.
Why is that?
Just I was excited for once I saw like kind of your outline of the things you thought we'd talk about. I was like, oh, I think this will be a really fun conversation, which it still was. I just didn't get to be a part of it. I got to watch it.
There wasn't quite as much nonsense at the top.
Yeah,
I noticed.
Hattie's got to work on that.
Yeah,
she's got. Yeah. She'll get there.
We did spend.
We'll
if you watch it, we spent some time trying to figure out why we go off on those tangents, and we figured out it was you.
I don't know if you figured anything out. You just blamed me, and I feel like those are two different things. Figuring it out means you actually have evidence of an answer.
That works for us.
I think you guys just went with it's David's fault.
Yeah,
which I'm fine with.
Yeah.
When we, if you watch New Hope Here, our online campus services, we often have at the very, very end of the service, just like a fun little
sneaky trailer,
a fun little
blooper,
fun little video from usually while we're filming. And I would like to point out that they're usually Hattie somehow getting us off the rails, I think, and the producer in the room is concurring with me. So I just have to fire back a little bit this week after being blamed last week.
Is it her getting off the rails, or she's reacting to you all? See it? I'm like this last weekend. She was the one that it was her fault. Well, I mean, she was trying to do what Michael had done earlier. She just did it poorly.
Oh, wait, what? I don't even know what we're talking about.
This last weekend, the crowd noise.
Yes,
the crowd noise.
Yeah, that derailed us quite a bit.
Awesome.
If you haven't seen Hattie try to make, can you? Are you familiar? No, you're not even going to try. That's probably
I'm not even going to try. Yeah,
it's a very common thing for most of us. I feel like
noise.
That. Yeah, you just make that like. I think Michael was saying I would shoot baskets in the yard or in the driveway or whatever, and then for myself when I make the game winner. That? It was very difficult apparently for Hattie, and it was pretty great. We're still laughing about it a couple weeks.
I might have greeted her that way yesterday at church.
That's fantastic. Well, yeah, check that out if you haven't. If you haven't been joining us on the weekends, or if you've missed any days or anything like that, you can always go on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/newhopehere.
Yeah.
I said those backwards.
I just realized I'm saying yesterday, and it was the message about Moses, so it would be a week ago from when this
yesterday for us recording this. But if you've missed any of that,
sorry to confuse you.
Yeah, if you've missed any of that, I think at this point, they're aware that it's not live.
Yeah.
One day we should do a live Grow podcast. That'd be fascinating.
Yeah. It would be awesome. We'd probably have all of 2 people watch live.
And then everyone just watches it after the fact. Yeah, that's true. But yeah, check out any of the weekend teachings that you missed. The full services are all posted on YouTube. So if you just want to find the message, you can usually skip, 30 minutes in and find Pastor Mike's message. Because we've been going through Threads. We just had week 5 of Threads.
We're almost to the end.
So I was going to say, there's only one left after this.
Yes.
This has been I don't know what to call it, a series or a mini series. I don't know what our producer is doing over here. He's
mini series. Season 1.
Season 1. There you go. The first part of The Greatest Story Ever Told has been so good. I know online we've had a lot of people posting in the chat, and I've got some emails even about just how impactful it's been. And
Hattie was actually telling me hundreds of people literally have picked up books.
That's awesome.
And we had all kinds of books for children, for a couple different kinds for children, and then teenagers, and then others, and everybody's following along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been very cool. Yeah, only 1 week of Threads left, but the weekend teaching this week was on limits. and the law.
It was on the law.
Yeah. And Pastor, if you missed it, Pastor Mike just read every law.
All 623 of them.
Just one at a time in a kind of a dry, monotone voice.
Yes.
And then
it
we
was
left.
The most exciting
It was my favorite Sunday.
Yeah.
But you opened the service kind of talking about something a little more personal. The fact that it's much harder to see Pastor Mike now if he turns sideways, if you watch the Grow podcast on the video, because you've slimmed down, and there are a lot of things that went into that.
We've talked about that a few different times.
We have. And so one of the things that you said was you needed to, and I think this is quoting it correctly, you needed to learn to live limited before focusing on what you needed to do, which was like your diet, for instance. Can you walk me through that a little bit? Isn't dieting living limited?
Yeah.
Like how do you learn how to diet before you diet? Don't you have to start dieting? That's
maybe
confusing.
You feel like it's semantics, but I think there's a perspective here, and you can play with the semantics of it if you want, of a couple different ways that we approach that. So many of us, myself included, for so many years, I think diets are a little bit like, at least for me, a little bit like New Year's resolutions.
Sure.
You make them, and 3 weeks later, you break it
or
whatever.
Good. That's pretty good.
Whatever it might be. But a diet, or whatever you want to call it, is looking at it. I need to limit. I'm gonna live and intentionally limit myself. And you say, well, that's exactly what you're doing. Yeah, but there's a little bit different perspective. When and some of this, I don't want to over spiritualize it for me, but there have been strongly biblical spiritual ties for me, because this goes all the way back to Satan's temptation of Adam and Eve in the garden. If we walk through the pattern of, question God, minimize consequences, and satisfy yourself. Those are kind of the first big three that Satan talked about. And when we begin to look at how God designed life to be lived, we start questioning, saying, yeah, but I don't want to live that way. Is that really the best way?
Sure.
And then we minimize the consequences of not living his way. But you notice what Adam and Eve did, specifically Eve, as she responded to Satan, is she didn't say what God said wasn't true. In fact, she quoted God, but she also changed it. Mm-hmm. And that's the most dangerous kind of truth. And so part of, even for me in my own health journey, is, I began to change some of the things. And there's two big ways that I kind of reacted to health. And I think they apply to other areas of life. I would either live limited, and this is a little bit like, almost, you kind of, this is a horrible way of putting it because I don't want to minimize this. It's like you're putting yourself in slavery to these limits. It's like, I'm so enslaved to this. I'm so, I'm in bondage. That may be a better way of doing that. Or I'm going to live unlimited. Screw this. I don't want to follow these limits. I mean, I'm free. And that's very much the American way, right?
For sure,
we think that freedom is living unlimited. Freedom is not living unlimited. Neither is it living limited. It's realizing that limits, the right limits, actually produce and protect life. Mm-hmm. So that was a long way around of me saying one of the things I needed to learn is that there is a way life is designed to be lived. Mm-hmm. Instead of looking at it as, oh, I have to do this. It's, no, I want life, and life is produced by me living a certain way.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, can you give us an example of that? Because, sure, it's, like the pastor says that limits produce life, so I should agree, but an actual
and it's interesting because the thread of this applies to almost every area of life. I mean,
mm-hmm.
think of the best, and we always pull out athletes,
don't
right?
Say we. You always pull out the sports.
But the sports reference, the best athletes there are,
mm-hmm.
they just live any way they want, and they're naturally good, right? No, they choose to live limited to do what? To produce the life they want.
Mm-hmm.
Dallas Willard years ago said, who's one of the great thinkers on this, he said, you get frustrated with the life that you have, but the reality is you're getting exactly the result of the life you're living. So think about what kind of life that you were designed to live, and then live in a way that produces that. And it will mean living limited.
Yeah.
It will mean living limited. If you want to be an Olympic athlete, you don't eat Jelly Bellies, every time you want. Probably means, you're in the gym or in the pool 8 hours a day. You're living limited, but to produce what? To produce the kind of life that you're called to live. So
give us an example in our spiritual life then.
I think in spiritual life, let's talk about Sabbath. Because, we tend to think legalistic. But look at the Ten Commandments. The one commandment that God spent more time than any of the other 10 talking about was what? The Sabbath. Go back and read it in Exodus 20. He talks about it longer than anything else. Part of it is because that's one of the limits. The others seem pretty obvious, right? Okay, I shouldn't kill anybody. Yeah, most of the time I can agree with that, honor the Lord your God. Okay, I don't always do that, but I get why. But Sabbath, wait, I'm not supposed to produce. I'm not supposed to work one day a week. What? That seems very limiting. But we were designed, and this goes all the way back to creation, we were not designed to be constant producers. So when God gave that to the Israelites, remember, they had lived for 430 years as their only value in life being told as, your job is to fill the storehouses of Egypt. And God was saying, no, that's not who you are. And how often do we get our identity mixed up in what we do and what we produce?
Sure.
That's not your identity. So you need one day a week to rest, to refill. There's a great book on resiliency out right now. Just recently came out by John Eldredge, one of my favorite authors. And he said, one of the things that's happened over the last 2 years with so many people is, whether we realize it or not, we've experienced trauma as a world, coming out of the pandemic. And even though different world leaders have declared it's over, is it not? But the real tragedy of the whole thing and the real trauma of the whole thing is we have reserves, and Dr. Henry Cloud talks about, we have reserves for a reason. We have reserves so that when there's a crisis, we can respond to it. But our reserves need to be refilled, and we haven't had opportunity to refill. And so you just do the math. You need to make sure that you spend time refilling after you've been emptying. And God built this schedule into our system. And actually scientists have done studies on this. If we were to truly live one day a week and disconnect, not produce, that's not the day we save to do all of our errands and everything else. It adds days, it adds years to our life, but it's living limited.
Yeah.
But it produces more life. It gives us more margin, gives us more thought. Time to think, time to worship, time to live life to the full.
I remember being a kid, and my mom had tons of houseplants, and I would at some point I was in charge of helping water them or whatever. But the concept of overwatering was so foreign to me as a kid, because I was like, it's water. If the tree's outside and it rains a lot, it gets that much water there, but understanding that even too much of this necessary thing for life could kill this plant. And I think I remember distinctly as a kid that analogy helping me understand why, these limits, that how does this help me be better? Having to limit myself in these ways, even sometimes from good things. But even too much of a good thing, like you're saying, it's not like those things are inherently bad, running errands on those days or whatever, but having that day to just refresh is important.
And the two extremes, the two reactions here, when we live with a limited mindset, basically, look at the progression that God took the Israelite through. So in Egypt, it was the land of never enough. So you're constantly living, I don't have enough, I don't have enough, I'm limited. And it diminished life. In the desert, it was the land of just enough, right? Because every morning they got manna, But if they kept it, it wasn't there. So God was teaching them dependence on him, but it was just enough. And what do they want? They want abundance. They want more. Mm-hmm. But he was teaching them that you need to live limited, because when you get into the promised land, you're going to have more than you need. But when you live limitless, it will actually drown your life.
Yeah.
And the beginning of the next series, Promised Land, not the first one, but the second one, where we get in the book of Judges, actually will talk about this. So you'll see these cycles of sin where they live in a time without limits, and life is good and life is great. And what happens? We live without limits, and it depleted their life. Yeah. It depleted their life. And then they go into this sin cycle over and over and over.
In your weekend teaching, you kind of had a list of how the law was designed, and then encouraged us to read the law.
Yeah.
So I did.
You read all of it. Yeah.
Well, I have.
You brought your Bible today.
I have. I do. I love this Bible. There were some of these where I was like, I'm not willing to just ad lib. What this law was. I'm going to read exactly how but you've given me permission to share some of these laws, and then you can help us identify what it was designed for, because each law was designed for a different purpose. So you had 4.
Yeah, we had 4 things we gave this weekend, this last weekend, that this teaching goes along with. It was some of the laws. So as you read through this, you can identify these, or just to remind us who God is in a world of made-up gods, or to remind us of the consequences of sin, or to protect them in the ancient world from sickness, corruption, injustice, ignorance, or to realign their life and their identity with God's design and purpose. And that's kind of big categories. As you read through it, you can tend to identify them that way. Other people have defined them this way: civil, ceremonial, and moral. That's the way a lot of scholars kind of define them. I add another category because I think it makes it a little bit easier to identify them.
Yeah. May I begin?
Go for it.
Okay,
you're going to try and trip me up.
We're going to start. Well, honestly, as I was saying earlier, I was really looking forward to being a part of last week's podcast. I was similarly looking forward to being a part of this week's podcast, because I always love when we get to talk about these kind of things. You know, when we first started the Grow podcast, and one of the things we talked about was I just would love when you and I would just sit down together and, you know, if it was something weird I read in the Bible that week, and I'd just bring it up, and I'd get to learn from you. And so we're going to do a little bit of that today. Right. I'm excited. Right. We're going to start in Leviticus 19:19. And just the second half, the first part talks about not letting cattle breed with a different kind, which we've definitely done a lot of that. We have all sorts of hybrid cattle. And then not sowing your field with 2 kinds of seed. But the last part of it is my favorite. Nor shall you wear a garment of cloth made of 2 kinds of material. Why couldn't the Israelites wear a garment of cloth made of 2 kinds of material? And which one does that fall into?
Well, and that's an interesting one, because scholars have kind of gone back and forth on that one, as to whether it was because of the kind of material they had, and when they would mix them together, it would actually cause problems. And I've heard that,
like medical issues.
Yeah, I don't buy it, you know, because I'm like, okay, you'd think they'd have figured that one out.
Yeah.
As I read it and understand it, and especially when you begin to look at some other things, and you can dig into this, there are some things that God asked them to do, like putting tassels on the edge of their clothing. That was purely to remind them of who they belong to. So we choose to live in a way that looks different than the rest of the world. So even when I'm getting dressed in the morning, it's realigning my life and my identity with God's design and God's purpose. And there's some of it that was ceremonial, where there, worship of other gods. They dressed a certain way and used certain kind of things, and God's saying, no, you aren't going to identify with that. So that's one of those that we aren't fully aware. It's in one of those kind of, to realign that.
To clarify, I didn't even tease Pastor Mike with which ones I might pick. So these are all off the top of his head. All right, we're gonna stay in Leviticus 19, and we're gonna go to verse 28.
You want me to quote it?
Yeah, please.
No, not gonna happen.
Leviticus 19, verse 28. You shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead, or tattoo yourselves. I am the Lord. Now, you have a lot of staff members
Yes.
that have tattoos.
And there's a lot of people who would use that one today as the reason why you can't get tattoos. What's interesting is later it's in the book of Ezekiel where it refers to God, and it's somewhat prophetic. And the Hebrew word that's used is talking about God. I have tattooed your name in the palm of my hands. So it's like, wait, what? But again, this is a lower story thing. We're talking upper story, lower story. So we need to understand the lower story historical context. In that culture, tattoos and cuts on the body were ways that people identified their allegiance to pagan gods and paganism. And God was saying, no, absolutely not. You will not do anything that will, because they would, do cuts on their body and designs and things. And it was forms of worship. It was self-abuse. And forms of worship. You will not do that in any way, shape, or form. I think we could also say there was probably some health thing there because they didn't have the health practices that we do today.
2022 tattoo parlor.
Clearly, it's to remind them of who God is in a world of made-up gods.
All right, we're going to the weirdest one for me. We're going next. Deuteronomy 25:11.
Okay.
And I'm definitely reading this one word for word out of the English Standard Version. When men fight with one another, and the wife of the one draws near to rescue her husband from the hand of him who is beating him, and puts her hand and seizes him by the private parts, now verse 12, then you shall cut off her hand, your eye shall have no pity.
Yeah.
So a couple of guys are in a bar fight, and the wife of one tries to save him and grabs there, and you have to cut off her hand. That one's rough for me. I don't know where we're going with that one. I have no idea what your answer is going to be.
And that's one of those you've got to dig into it. And I honestly haven't dug into it a lot, other than I do know this about it. So many of these laws were laws to protect them. We talk about health laws, but also corruption, injustice, and ignorance. So remember, they were living in a world that was increasingly crazy, increasingly bloody, increasingly perverse. And so part of what, and I only know on this from what I've read and understood from some academics, part of the protection on that was there were women who would treat women and men who would treat each other with less than the value of a human being. And so when a woman would grab a hold of a man's private parts, it was treating them with dishonor, with disrespect, even though they're in a fight, and that saying, no, that's not how God's people will act. Even if they're in the middle of this, we will not treat people with disrespect and lack of honor. So it's part of that protecting them from injustice, ignorance, and devaluing life.
Interesting.
On that.
All right, I have 1.5 left.
Okay.
All right, we're going to go to Exodus now, 23, verse 19. And the second half of the verse says, you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. First of all, I think we'd all agree that that's just mean if you do that. Yeah. But which one would that fall into?
That most likely that would be to protect. There's some of these like that. You just go, what in the world? And so many of that was, protect them from sickness. And scholars have suggested some of that, and some of it is just okay. Just don't act that way.
Don't do that.
Yeah, just don't act that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
This last one, we're actually going to the New Testament.
Okay.
Quick. And let me grab it. It's Matthew 19. Just give me a minute here as I change the very thin pages of my Bible. Matthew 19, verses 7 and 8.
Okay.
They said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? Jesus said to them, this is verse 8, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And so my question is, are a number of the laws laws that like not even God wanted those laws, but they were almost concessions to, you guys are doing these dumb things. I'm going to basically put these things in place to limit the damage that you're doing with your sin, basically, rather than you're not going to sin at all. I'm going to limit the damage. Like you're doing this, you're divorcing your wife, so I'm going to put this into place to make it not as harmful. Is that common?
I think that's I don't know how common we could say it is,
sure.
But
because he only references the one law.
That part of the law, and we find this out. Paul deals with this in, I think it's Galatians, if I remember right. Let me look it up here real quick. Yeah, Galatians chapter 3 says the law was essentially the guardian of our hearts. So part of what the law, and Paul talks about this in Romans, was to reveal to us the hardness of our heart. So remember, God is taking, let's just use Israel here, is taking them out of Egypt, out of 430 years of being surrounded by paganism and pantheism, and leading them into the kind of life that they've never experienced, never seen. Yeah. And it's not like he goes, all right, now live this way tomorrow. He's leading them towards it. And it would be like, a parent, in some ways, and this analogy breaks down, but in some ways, I don't just put my child on a bike and say, okay, ride it. There's a reason there's training wheels. You're going to fall. You're going to mess up. And that's part of the purpose of that law is God's going, okay, I know you're going to, out of the hardness of your hearts, so let's try and minimize the damage.
So it'd be like putting a helmet on your kid, using that analogy.
Yeah.
Certainly I don't want you to fall off this bike, but when you inevitably do, this is going to protect you from further damage.
And we see other examples of that. You get into 1 Corinthians where Paul spends a whole chapter talking about marriage, divorce, and singleness, and being married to someone who's not of the faith, and should you leave them, should you not leave them. But here's what we know: God hates divorce. I mean, Scripture says that explicitly for any reason. He wants us to be restored, just like God hates sin. But he made a path for us to be restored to it, and made it possible for him to come into us and to begin to transform us. But it's a process. Remember this thread. God always does things the right way. He doesn't just snap his fingers and suddenly we're delivered and no longer able to sin. He's growing us up in it.
Let's talk real quick because we need to. We're going to go long because I read 75 verses for us. But let's talk real quick about the 10 Commandments. They're one of the primary things you kind of learn in like Sunday school. At least we did when I did when I was growing up. That a pretty common thing that even people that aren't very connected to the faith at all, they're familiar with the 10 Commandments. There's fights about having them in courthouses and on city property and statues in front lawns and things. But if the law no longer applies, then why are we so obsessed with the 10 Commandments?
Yeah, well, a couple of things we need to keep in mind. One of the things we talked about in the weekend teaching on this is, remember, the 10 Commandments were just the first 10. Yep. So if we want to fight for them being on the court walls, do we want all 623 of them? No, we don't. And we've got a few things. We've got to remember what God is doing. And it goes back to what we were just talking about. God was teaching how to live an abundant life in a messed up world. Yeah. In a messed up world. So the 10 Commandments were the opening salvo of a series of things, teaching us how to live better, love God, and love people. If we really want to summarize the law and put it on a courtroom wall, we should probably put in there, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. It says, and Scripture says this, for what? For the entirety of the law is summed up there. And as we read through this, Jesus said, don't think I've come to abolish these, but I've come to fulfill them. So these were designed to do what? To guard us from a messed up world, but to also lead us and point us to Jesus, to realize we can't live up to these without help. Yeah. And so many of them were for the context of the time. That's another key thing, is we've got to understand that. That's one of the reasons why I gave us those 4 things.
Yep.
To understand this is for the context of the time. So when you read it, okay, what would if you were to make a context for today of maybe ways that, let's talk about clothing. A great author, John Mark Comer, JMC, talks about this, how, slavery hasn't gone away. In fact, one of the greatest, there's 2 great, huge slave markets in the world today. One is, of course, sex slavery. The other one is in the clothing industry. And the dirty secret is most of our clothes are actually made by people who are in forced labor in the world today. So what might be, and this is one of the things we just need to wrestle with, and I'm just suggesting for you to wrestle with this, what might be something today that would have us stand out as followers of Christ when it comes to our clothes? How should we live to say, this is wrong? Do we just say we aren't going to buy clothes anywhere, anytime? Well, that would be a problem, right?
We should wear clothes.
Yeah, we should wear clothes. Yes. There's another issue there. But what if we lived in a way and minimized even our clothing in a way? So to put God on display and say we value life and we value people in all of its forms. So I think we can work through these the specificity of most of these, specifically the ceremonial and the ritualistic or kind of legal laws, no longer specifically apply, but the heart of them certainly does.
Yeah.
Anything that would protect us from sickness, corruption, injustice, ignorance. We change the context of it, but what should we do? As part of my health journey. And again, not to over-spiritualize it or put in any kind of shame or guilt, I've realized God created this body, and I was not treating it the way that God would have me steward it. And so I've had to choose to steward it. Does that mean I don't enjoy pecan cake at Thanksgiving? No, absolutely. I mean, God made pecans, and I think He made them specifically for pecan pie. But I don't need the entire pie.
Probably.
Yeah, that's the good stewardship of that. And so there is a health, quote unquote, limit that I put myself under in order to produce life. And not living under that limit, it will actually inhibit life.
Do you have any next steps, any homework or anything like that for us this week, Pastor Mike?
Same thing that we talked about in the weekend teaching. Go through and look at Scripture with the lens of those 4 things that we just talked about. And I would add to this, ask, so today, what would something like this look like that would produce life, not limit life, but produce life in today's context and in our world?
Well, thank you, Pastor Mike. Appreciate it. I was very glad to be back on the podcast this week. We appreciate all of you guys for listening, for your feedback, some questions that are getting sent in. We're getting pretty close to being able to do a Q&A, I think. I got a couple more, and we can start to plan that. So that will be fun. I want to remind you, if you haven't subscribed yet, wherever you listen to the podcast on, the video podcast you can always find on YouTube and Apple Podcasts as well. We're also on Spotify, but subscribe wherever you are. That way you get notified when the new episodes go live. I also want to encourage you to share this podcast with people in your life, particularly your other New Hope family. I got an email from someone this weekend, and she was talking about how that their small group, they brought up the Grow podcast, and some of the people in the group just weren't really familiar. Even though, we've mentioned it, but sometimes you just aren't listening during announcements or whatever. I'm not sure what happened, but they mentioned that they started talking about the Grow podcast, and then everybody started subscribing to it, and they were all excited about it. So you might think that your friend who you go to church with listens or knows about the Grow podcast, but just ask them. Be sharing, because it's a great way for all of us to continue to grow throughout the week. We say it every week on the Grow podcast, but growth always starts with the next step. And this is one of those next steps, diving a little bit deeper, going a little bit further into that weekend teaching with Pastor Mike. So we thank you for being here. Make sure you share the podcast and send in some questions. David, Daved at newhopewilson.com. I need a few more questions for Pastor Mike. So we love you, and we will see you next time.